Sherlock Holmes and the Case of the Giant Monster Serial Killer. Chapter 1, Murder in the Mist. Not all the mysteries of London can be explained by reason. But whenever the fog settles so thickly that one cannot see beyond an arm's length, people know that death could be lurking behind every step. Early Tuesday morning, October 17, 1891. A chilling scream pierced the air from the northern outskirts of Highgate, where locals still refer to the area as the Valley of Fog. In the dim morning light and the biting cold clinging to each stone-paved slab, the body of George Merrick, a middle-aged gardener, was found. His corpse was, quite literally, torn apart, blood spattered across the small yard in front of the ramshackle wooden cabin where he lived. His chest had been ripped open as if clawed by a savage beast, ribs shattered, and his eyes wide open in a look of hopeless terror, as though still gazing at something beyond the imagination. News spread like wildfire. People gathered outside the police cordon, whispering about a wild animal, a deranged murderer, or something worse, a monster. The situation was dire enough that Inspector Lestrade personally came to the scene with an investigative team. But when he heard the account of the sole witness, the stern look on his face turned into one of unmistakable doubt. The witness was a young boy named Oliver Grant, the son of a local carriage driver. He claimed to have seen a creature nearly 3 meters tall, hunchbacked, with shoulders as wide as an iron gate, and glowing red eyes like smoldering coals. It stood motionless in the fog for just a few seconds, but long enough to nearly send the boy collapsing in fear. Then, it vanished into the darkness as if it had never existed. Lestrade was not one to easily believe in the fantastical. Yet the strangeness of the case, and especially the deep, enormous footprints, 3 times the size of a grown man's, imprinted clearly into the hardened earth beside the body, made it impossible for him to ignore the possibility of something beyond the ordinary. After much deliberation, he decided to visit the flat on Baker Street, home to a man whose acuity surpassed even the laws of physics, Sherlock Holmes. Holmes was sitting pensively by the fireplace, his bow resting gently against the violin as he plucked a few quiet notes. The room glowed with warm light and the faint scent of Earl Grey tea hung in the air. I, John Watson, had just finished a letter to an old friend when Lestrade arrived, his coat still damp with mist and his face taut with tension. Holmes glanced at him, then rose and clasped his hands behind his back. "It doesn't seem like you've come to chat about the weather, Inspector." Lestrade placed a leather case on the table, opened it, and pulled out a few photographs and a newspaper clipping. "We've got a murder. A gardener was killed in a manner difficult to describe. The body was mangled, nearly unidentifiable if not for the identification card in his pocket. But what troubles me most are these footprints." Holmes bent down to examine the black and white photograph of the prints. His eyes narrowed. Not human. Not canine. Not equine. Far too large, and the weight pressing down exceeds normal biological limits. The ground is indented nearly 8 centimeters. Whatever made this, is either an unknown giant beast, or something entirely different. Lestrade shot a quick glance at me, then back at Holmes. "I know it sounds mad, but the witness said the creature stood nearly 3 meters tall. With red eyes. And it vanished into the mist." Holmes smiled, a smile that was neither pleased nor mocking. "I've never heard testimony so detailed and so absurd at the same time. But it is precisely that contradiction that makes this case interesting. Watson, get your coat. We have work to do." Highgate grew colder as the evening fell. The fog wrapped itself around the winding paths and hilly roads, isolating the area from the rest of London. We arrived at the scene just as darkness began to consume the sky. The victim's home was cordoned off with police tape. A few curious locals still lingered nearby. Holmes requested access to the body, by then moved to a temporary storage room in a small morgue near the church. I will spare the description of the corpse here. But suffice it to say, what we saw was enough to chill even a battle-hardened soldier like myself. Not just the deep claw marks or the torn body parts, but the eyes, still wide open, staring up at the sky, as if frozen in the moment of witnessing an unimaginable nightmare. Holmes approached the site where the body had been found, knelt, and silently examined the ground. He took out his magnifying glass and studied each trace intently. Then, he followed the series of footprints embedded into the earth, leading from the nearby woods and then seemingly back again. Strangely, there were no returning prints. As if the creature had vanished into thin air. Holmes furrowed his brow. This creature is not only tall and heavy. It moves with precision. Not like a wild animal. The steps are evenly spaced, more than a meter apart. And the rear prints are deeper than the front. That suggests a leap, or a lunge forward. We ventured into the forest, the presumed escape route of the creature. The air was thick and unnaturally quiet, so much so that the wind through the leaves sounded like a moan from the earth itself. The deeper we went, the more the cold seeped into our bones. Then Holmes stopped. "Look, Watson." On the trunk of a large oak tree were claw marks, gouged deep into the heartwood. 5 grooves, nearly 40 centimeters long. Clearly not made by a knife, and certainly not by a bear. None of which exist in England at this time. The bark was still fresh, indicating the marks were made within the last 12 hours. Holmes stood silently for a moment. His eyes no longer held their usual gleam of irony but instead were filled with complete focus. He pulled out a notepad, scribbled a few lines, and tucked it into his coat. I asked softly, "What do you think, Holmes?" He answered in a low voice. "I think, we are standing before something that has never been recorded in any book of biology, criminology, or mythology. The question is no longer who killed George Merrick. The question is, what are we facing?" As we left the forest, the fog had thickened so much we couldn't see the face of someone standing just a few steps away. A sudden gust of wind blew past, carrying with it a distant sound from somewhere in the valley. It was impossible to tell whether it was the howl of the wind, or the growl of something watching us from the shadows. I turned back for one last look. The tree shadows stretched like skeletal hands clawing at the ground. I felt as though a pair of eyes were fixed on us from afar. And I wondered, had we just awakened an ancient nightmare? Holmes walked ahead in silence. But I noticed his hand clenched tighter than usual in his coat pocket. He felt it too. And for the first time in many years, I saw doubt in the eyes of a man who believed that everything could be explained by logic. In the fog-bound streets of London, a nightmare had just begun. Chapter 2, Traces in the Night. In the darkness, what is truly terrifying is not what we can see, but the things that leave behind traces, yet have never been seen by anyone. The London night was thick with fog, like a damp curtain draped over every rooftop, every flickering gaslight. After our first trip to the crime scene of George Merrick, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street with more questions than answers. But just a few hours later, a telegram from Inspector Lestrade arrived, compelling us to return to Highgate immediately. This time, it wasn't because of another death. The night watchman at St. Mary's Church had reported seeing something strange near the forest where Holmes had paused the previous day. In the darkness, he spotted a faint streak of light passing through the woodland path, not unlike the glow of a firefly, but moving in a long, continuous trail. Holmes said just one thing upon reading the message: we must see it before sunrise. We arrived at the site at precisely 3:15 in the morning. The night was unnervingly quiet. No one was around the church except for the watchman, an elderly man with a gaunt face and a silver beard, who looked as though he hadn't slept in a week. He led us down a narrow path behind the church, through a moss-covered cemetery, to the edge of the woods where the strange light had been seen. There, under the glow of the oil lamp Holmes carried, we saw something that made even me take a step back. A long trail of blood, but not the deep crimson one would expect. It was pale blue, faintly luminescent, glowing like a soft phosphorescence in the dark. Holmes knelt down, drew a small knife, and collected a sample into a glass vial, observing it under his magnifying lens. He said nothing for several minutes. I knew that silence well. It meant he was facing something he had never encountered before. The trail snaked through the fallen leaves, winding as if something had been injured, yet still strong enough to retreat. But oddly, there were no clear footprints, neither human nor animal, on the ground. As if the wounded thing had glided over the earth instead of walking. The thought sent a chill down my spine. We continued following the blood trail in absolute silence. Eventually, we reached the side of an abandoned cottage at the forest's edge, where Holmes stopped abruptly. On the west-facing wooden wall of the house were deep claw marks, long and evenly spaced, as if a blade had slashed across it. 4 parallel gashes, each about 3 centimeters deep and nearly a meter long. The torn wood curled and warped, as though it had been ripped apart by a force of immense pressure. At the top of each mark was a dark-stained patch, where the glowing blood had dried, leaving behind blotches like the remnants of a nightmare imprinted upon reality. Holmes exhaled, his eyes no longer narrowed in curiosity, but in silent vigilance. He used his gloved hand to pick up a splintered piece of wood and held it near the lamp. The break wasn't caused by a knife. Nor an axe. This was the result of direct physical force. A single blow from something harder than iron, sharper than stone. I asked quietly, my throat suddenly dry. If not a tool, then what? Holmes replied without taking his eyes off the wood. A claw. That single word seemed to thicken the darkness around us. Even the forest appeared to hold its breath, and the wind, usually whispering through the high branches, had disappeared entirely. We returned to the church just before dawn. The night watchman, upon seeing us again, only shook his head and sighed. But what unsettled me most wasn't the glowing blood or the claw marks, it was the whispers we heard on our way back from a few nearby homes, where the townsfolk had begun speaking of a creature from hell. The first tale I heard came from an elderly woman sitting by a window, her eyes reflecting the flicker of a candle. She spoke of an ancient legend passed down in Highgate for hundreds of years, about a being known only by a name no one dared speak aloud, the Nameless One. According to her, it had once been sealed away by a group of medieval monks, buried beneath this forest, where there had once stood a monastery before it was consumed by fire. The legend said that once every century, in a year where a solar eclipse coincided with a long, unbroken fog, the seal would weaken. And if human blood were to touch the sacred earth, the creature would awaken to reclaim what was stolen, its body, and its soul. Holmes did not interrupt her, nor did he scoff. He simply listened, then jotted down several ancient place names the woman mentioned, most notably, the underground crypt where the monastery had once stood. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the sun had fully risen, but even its light could not dispel the chill that had settled in my chest. Holmes sat quietly by the window, watching the people below. He spoke slowly, without turning to me. There are 3 things that disturb me, Watson. First, the blood, it does not react to any reagent I've ever used. Second, the absence of footprints, it suggests this creature moves in a way not consistent with any skeletal or joint-based anatomy known to us. And third, and most troubling of all, the marks on the wall indicate it was testing its strength. Not attacking. Testing. I sat across from him, staring intently. You think it's learning how to kill more effectively? Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he nodded, very slightly. The following night, we received news from Lestrade. A farmer living near the forest's edge reported that his livestock pen had been torn apart. Not a single animal survived. But they hadn't been eaten. They had been cut open, examined, as if by someone with a penchant for anatomical analysis. Holmes finished reading the report, then turned to me, his voice sharp as a blade. We are no longer dealing with a mere monster, Watson. This is an entity capable of thought. And purpose. Fear began to spread through the community around Highgate. Some families packed up and fled the town, taking their belongings with them. Others gathered nightly around the church, lighting candles and praying. The legend of the Nameless One suddenly became the talk of every tavern and marketplace. Holmes did not intervene. He only observed. And on the third night, he quietly visited the city archive, searching for maps from the 13th century. There, he found records of the ancient monastery, the crypt beneath it, and a vast underground tunnel network stretching beneath Highgate, once used to store forbidden books and imprison heretics over 500 years ago. Pointing to the map, Holmes spoke to me in a tone I had rarely heard from him, a mix of fascination and something close to fear. If something was sealed away, Watson, then this is where it sleeps. And if it is now waking, then it will return to where it began. I looked at the map, at the winding tunnels like veins beneath the earth. A cold sensation crept up my spine. And I understood, the most dangerous part of this nightmare was still ahead. Chapter 3: The Eyes in the Dark Forest. In every mysterious case, there is always a moment when instinct defeats reason, and sometimes, survival hinges on whether we dare to trust that feeling. When the police carriage pulled up to Baker Street at dawn on the fourth day, I was making tea, and Holmes was examining a blood sample under his microscope. Inspector Lestrade entered, not even having removed his hat, his face pale and lips slightly trembling from the cold. But his voice cut through the morning fog like a knife. "Another person is dead. Hung upside down on an old oak in the ancient forest near Harlow, 20 miles from here. The condition of the body, identical to George Merrick." Holmes looked up. No one said anything more. No one needed to. Minutes later, we were on the road out of London. The forest near Harlow was unlike any other ancient woodland. The towering trees stood close together, their bark blackened as if scorched, and the canopy so dense that even midday sunlight could only pierce through in weak rays. When we arrived, the crime scene had been cordoned off. The police stood silently like statues around a massive oak at the center of the forest. From it hung the victim's body, a middle-aged man in a hunter's coat, suspended by tendons stripped from his own wrists. I had seen my share of death in war, but I had to turn away. The body hadn't simply been killed. It had been manipulated, mocked like a grotesque plaything. His neck was broken, eyes wide open as if he had seen something unspeakable in his final moment. Holmes did not touch the corpse. He merely observed the surroundings. And then, he stopped. This time, there were footprints. We followed them. Deep, heavy, unnaturally long, as if the creature that made them was nearly 2 meters tall and weighed more than any ordinary man. But after 30 meters, Holmes came to a halt. He signaled me to stop. Beneath the dry leaves was another set of footprints. Smaller, more even, like the tracks of an average human boot. But oddly, the two sets of prints led in opposite directions. One going in, one coming out. One light, one pressing deep into the earth. And most curiously, both stopped suddenly at the same exact spot. Holmes crouched, gently using the tip of his cane to lift the soil where the two trails met. He whispered just loud enough for me to hear. "They met here." I swallowed hard, the wind whispering through the trees like unintelligible murmurs. Holmes stood, his eyes sharp and cold. This murder was more refined, better staged. The large footprints may be real. But the small ones are bait. I asked why he was so certain. Holmes didn't answer right away. Instead, he scraped a layer of earth onto his glove and held it up for me to see. In the dim light, two distinct textures were visible. One dry, one moist. The smaller prints had been made with the dry soil, laid atop the damp layer, meaning they were added afterward. Someone had reconstructed the scene, deliberately leaving conflicting clues. But why? We ventured deeper into the forest, following a very faint blood trail, nearly erased by the wind. It led us to a narrow path, opening into a less dense area of the forest where a few beams of sunlight filtered through the leaves. And it was there that I saw something that froze me to the core. For a fleeting moment, between the tree shadows, a pair of glowing red eyes appeared. Not large, not bright like lanterns, but vivid enough to be unmistakable. They didn't move. They simply stood still, watching from afar. I froze, gripping the pistol in my coat pocket tightly. Holmes followed my gaze, but when he turned, the eyes were gone. He asked what I had seen. I wasn't sure how to describe it, only that I was absolutely certain, something was watching us. Not human. Not wild beast. It was an intelligent gaze, and fearless. Holmes didn't doubt me. Instead, he sighed, as if acknowledging a suspicion he had tried to deny. He said that wasn't the first time the eyes had appeared. I was stunned. He told me that back in Highgate, after we left the claw-marked wooden house, he had seen a shadow on the hill. When he raised his lamp, it vanished. And he had kept silent, not wanting to alarm me without proof. But now, it seemed the entity had begun to reveal itself. We returned to Harlow to inquire about the victim. The man was Benjamin Cole, a professional hunter who lived alone in a wooden cabin near the forest's edge. According to the villagers, he had bragged about seeing strange lights at night and claimed he was tracking a creature he believed to be an undocumented species. 3 days before his death, he had said something that gave many people chills. I saw it. And it saw me. Holmes didn't hide his contemplation. I knew he was trying to connect the pieces. 2 cases, 2 victims, 20 miles apart. But the killings were identical. Not done for the sake of killing quickly, but as a statement. To kill, then hang the body, as proof of power and intent. Holmes whispered to me as we left the tavern. This creature isn't just hunting. It's selecting. We returned to the forest once more as the sun was setting. Holmes's instincts told him the entity only appeared at night. We set up a temporary camp roughly 500 yards from the crime scene, hidden in a thick bush with a clear view of the path into the deep woods. I couldn't sleep. Neither could Holmes. At midnight, as the mist began to slither through the roots of the trees, a sound emerged. Faint, like wind brushing against cloth. But Holmes whispered, "Not the wind." I looked around. And then, like a chill slicing through my skin, I felt something behind me. When I turned, nothing was there. But Holmes signaled, "Silence." In the forest shadows, about 50 paces from us, the red eyes appeared again. This time, they didn't stay still. They moved, slowly, deliberately, as if fully aware that we were watching. Then they disappeared behind a tree. Holmes pulled out his pocket watch, noting the time. He muttered. "Tracking the appearance, about once every 3 nights, but along a route. It has a pattern." I asked, "What if it knows we're tracking it?" Holmes replied, "It's not hiding. It's taunting." When we left the forest the next morning, Holmes made a conclusion that left me shaken. It's not an ordinary killer. Nor merely an ancient creature. It's something that combines both. An intelligence not from our era, but also not of this world. I had never seen Holmes doubt his own reason like that. But what he said next chilled me to the bone. If it's choosing its victims, Watson, then we've already been chosen. Chapter 4, The Castle of the Madman. Sometimes, to trace the footprints of the devil, one must enter the place where reason was burned to ash long ago. When we left the Harlow forest at dawn the following day, Holmes did not return to London. Instead, he led me northward, down a different path. He offered little explanation, merely saying there was a place he had once read about in old records, and that now, it had become a crucial link in this increasingly chilling chain of mysteries. We passed through many desolate regions, moss-covered trails, and forests so silent they seemed to reject all sound. Finally, as the sun rose high in the sky, a grand, decaying structure appeared before us, still majestic in form despite the passage of time. It was a gray stone castle, lying quietly in the valley, untouched for decades. Trees had grown through shattered windows, and the weather-worn walls bore the stains of age. Yet what sent a chill down my spine was the oppressive feeling that hung over the place. As if something had once been imprisoned here, and then escaped. Holmes called this place Blackmere Castle. According to him, the last owner of Blackmere was an eccentric scientist named Dr. Aldous Finn, who had been expelled from the Royal Scientific Council at the end of the previous century for unethical experiments. No one knew whether he had died or simply vanished. It was only known that the castle had been abandoned after a strange fire, which no one ever investigated. Holmes had once come across a mention of Finn in the journal of a psychiatrist. That man is not insane, he simply lived too far ahead of his time for anyone to comprehend. We stepped inside the castle. The air was icy cold. Long corridors were thick with dust and cobwebs. The stone staircase leading to the basement was nearly collapsed. But Holmes seemed drawn downward, as if by some invisible force. After over an hour of searching, we managed to open a rusted steel door that led to the old laboratory. Inside was another world. Time seemed to have stopped. Beneath a thick layer of dust were hundreds of sketches, models, bizarre handcrafted devices, and glass jars containing tissue samples that had not completely decayed. I picked up a torn sheet of drawing paper. On it was the image of a towering creature, with a complex muscular structure, a spine exposed like jagged spikes, and eyes, glowing red. My heart froze. Holmes read aloud the scrawled note beneath it: Gene modification, version number 14. Combination of human tissue, animal, X factor. I asked what the X factor was. Holmes remained silent. Then he opened several more documents, flipping through them as though searching for a missing puzzle piece. In a leather-bound notebook, he stopped. Jagged lines of handwriting appeared, like whispers from the depths of hell. Not evolution. Not hybridization. This is a leap beyond the bounds of creation. Not the making of a creature, but the redefinition of life itself. I didn't want to believe it. But the pieces, the evidence, were stacking up. These murders weren't the acts of a beast driven by instinct. This was a biological machine, programmed to hunt, to choose its targets, and to leave a message. Holmes led me to a locked steel cabinet. It took nearly half an hour to open. Inside was a model of a neural structure, completely different from human physiology. But what truly horrified me was that inside the cabinet was also a tracking logbook. Names of test subjects. Each name crossed out, except for the last one. M13, stable maintenance. Response exceeded threshold. Uncontrollable. Has escaped. Holmes closed his eyes briefly. His voice lowered. We are not facing a monster. We are pursuing a madness replicated through science. I asked him, if that were true, why had it only appeared after more than 30 years? Holmes replied that perhaps it had lain dormant, imprisoned, or wandered aimlessly in unconscious slumber. Until something awakened its old instincts, the scent of blood, a signal from familiar soil, or simply the return of a biological memory. We left the castle as the evening shadows stretched across the ground. Before departing, Holmes took a piece of the creature's anatomical sketch and the notebook. What haunted me most was not the diagrams. It was the final line, written in red ink. If it returns to the place of origin, humanity will no longer stand atop the evolutionary chain. On the journey back, Holmes said nothing. But in his eyes, I saw not his usual cold detachment, but the inner struggle of a rational man forced to accept that some things lie beyond explanation. He looked at me and spoke slowly. Watson, I am no longer certain this is a case that can be solved with logic. But I do know one thing, that creature is not a product of nature. I asked, then what must we do next? Holmes answered, we must go to the last place Finn was known to have lived before he disappeared. A forgotten monastery in the Northmoor Mountains. Perhaps that is where, it has returned. Chapter 5, The Giant Hiding in the Mist. It's not what we see in the fog that's truly frightening, but what knows we're watching and still chooses to remain hidden. Upon returning to the town of Rookmere, before we could even set foot inside the inn, a gaunt man with disheveled hair and beard rushed over and grabbed Holmes by the arm. He was trembling, from the cold, and from something far more terrifying than the chill of the Highlands. I recognized him as old Abel, the solitary shepherd who lived alone on Blakemore Hill to the west. The locals called him a madman, but none had ever seen him this frightened. Abel panted, pointing toward the mountains. It was huge. I heard a roar like splitting stone, then that massive shadow swept across the hill. Not a man. Not a beast. That thing, it's looking for something. Holmes said nothing, simply watching the old man intently. But the moment Abel finished his account, Holmes's eyes narrowed. He immediately left the inn and told me to bring the map of the Blakemore Hill region. We ascended the hill at twilight. The air was thick with fog, so dense that we had to stoop to see the ground beneath our feet. But the clues Holmes sought were not on the path. Beside Abel's hut, the grass was trampled in a strange, irregular pattern. Deep claw marks scarred the trees. And then Holmes pointed out something that made my skin crawl, the drag marks of a sheep being pulled away, but without any blood. Not a single drop. I asked. If it were a wild beast, why wouldn't it eat right there? Holmes nodded, as though I had just confirmed his own suspicion. He showed me a hastily stacked pile of stones at the edge of the forest. Beneath it were tufts of wool and a scrap of white fabric. It didn't kill to eat. It took it. A chill ran through me. Abel's seemingly mad tale now matched the physical evidence. Down to every detail. Holmes asked me. Why would a towering, powerful creature capable of tearing a man apart in an instant, take a sheep alive? I had no answer. But Holmes already had a theory. That night, at the old local watch station, we reopened the records of abandoned mines around Rookmere. One name appeared repeatedly, North Hollow Mine, sealed off 30 years ago after a mysterious collapse that left all miners missing. No bodies, no messages, only echoes from deep underground. Holmes said. Suppose M13, that modified creature, escaped long ago. It couldn't survive in the wild without being discovered. Unless, it took shelter in a place no one dares to go. The mine was the perfect refuge. Cold, deep, dark, and most importantly, isolated. I asked. Then why take the sheep? Holmes looked at me, unblinking. Not for food. But to keep. It might be, learning how to care for something. Or, waiting for a command. We approached the North Hollow site at first light. The entire area was fenced off, with cave-in warning signs posted on wooden stakes. But one section of the fence had been broken, clear signs that someone, or something, had passed through. We entered quietly. The air was thick and stale. Our lanterns cut through rotting timber supports and tunnel walls eroded by time. Holmes stopped at a narrow chamber, where a faint metallic scent lingered and a long drag mark scored the stone floor. In the center was an iron collar, bent as if by a giant's hand. From deep within, a faint rustling sound echoed. Holmes signaled to turn off the light. We held our breath. A low growl rose from the earth, not loud, but deep enough to make my heart pound wildly. We retreated and left the mine before sunrise. But Holmes took two things with him, a tuft of hair caught in a rock crevice, and an old map buried beneath the soil, marking a path to mine shaft 4, a section never listed in public records. That evening, in our room at the inn, Holmes sat in deep contemplation for a long time. I asked, "What do you make of it?" Holmes replied, "I don't think it's lost. Every sign, every movement, has purpose." I pressed further. "Then who is controlling it?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. But when he pulled out the old anatomical sketch from Blackmere Castle and laid it beside the mine map, his eyes glinted with a sharp, cold light. It's not mad. It remembers. And if that memory is returning, then perhaps, it's finding its way back to where it was created. I was stunned into silence. Holmes added. But perhaps, it's not coming back alone. Chapter 6, The Secret Beneath the Earth. The most dangerous thing isn't the monster out there, but the doors that were never meant to be opened. We returned to North Hollow on a moonless night. This time, Holmes brought a specialized oil lantern, a wooden case containing test tubes, and a revolver carefully tucked into his coat pocket. Not a word was spoken during the entire walk from the town to the mine's edge. It wasn't out of fear, but a shared, unshakable instinct that we were about to enter a place from which no one had ever returned. Inside the mine, a chilling silence reigned. The lantern's light illuminated cold stone walls, where the scars of the last days of excavation were still etched. But deeper still, beneath the rusted beams, something entirely different awaited. Holmes discovered a steel door hidden behind a collapsed wall. The handle was smeared with fresh grease. Someone had used it recently. With a set of lockpicks, he worked in complete silence, and after a few tense minutes, the door creaked open with a blood-curdling screech. Behind it was a long corridor, lined with jet-black tiles, descending into the depths with no visible end. The air here was noticeably different, colder, thicker, tinged with the scent of metal and faint chemicals. We ventured in. Every footstep echoed as if someone else were following us from behind. At the far end, the tunnel opened into a large chamber, an abandoned underground laboratory. But it was not dusty, not forgotten. Machines still hummed, slowly, wearily, like a dying mechanical organism clinging to life. On a central table stood large glass containers filled with murky golden liquid, some still bubbling faintly, proof that biological activity had not ceased. Holmes cautiously examined the test tubes, jotting down notes in his notebook. While he was observing, I noticed strange formulae on the walls. Inscribed on boards in a script unlike any scientific language I had ever seen. I was about to call out to Holmes when a rasping breath echoed in the dark. We both froze. It wasn't human, nor fully animal. The sound had rhythm, weight, and most importantly, it was getting closer. From the end of the corridor, heavy footsteps resounded. The walls trembled with each step. Holmes swiftly grabbed a vial of dark blue liquid, sealed it, and slipped it into his inner coat pocket. We extinguished the lantern and retreated into a corner of the room, holding our breath. Through the gap in the doorway, I glimpsed a massive shape, nearly twice the height of a man, shuffling forward slowly. Along its back protruded metallic spinal segments, jutting through flesh like steel vertebrae. Its eyes gave off no light, but somehow, it could see in the dark. We didn't wait for it to approach. Holmes snapped a small glass tube and hurled it against the wall on the far side of the corridor. The shattering sound echoed sharply, drawing the creature's attention. In that brief moment, we bolted from the room, racing back through the tunnel toward the surface. A guttural roar followed, harsh and primal, but we didn't stop. We sprinted through the steel door, into the main shaft, and only when natural light touched our eyes did we finally breathe deeply again. We collapsed onto the grass outside, our bodies trembling. Holmes opened his coat pocket and showed me the vial. In the pale sunlight, the liquid inside shimmered with a strange violet-gray hue. I asked, "What do you think it is?" Holmes replied, "The answer. Or at least, a piece that will lead us to the one who created that monster." I said, "It wasn't born naturally, was it?" Holmes nodded. He took out a small dropper and placed a few drops onto a testing strip. The strip turned red, then rapidly darkened to pitch black. Holmes documented the reaction, his expression more grave than ever. He said, "This substance contains a DNA sequence that matches no known organism. That means, either it belongs to a completely new species, or it's the result of deliberate genetic fusion. I looked at him. Then who created it? Holmes replied. Someone who once lived in Blackmere Castle, or someone who continued his research. I asked. And if the laboratory is still operational, then? Holmes looked straight at me, his voice lowered. Then the creature may not be the only one. We returned to the town late in the afternoon. Holmes sent the vial to a colleague at the Central Laboratory in London using the fastest available courier system. While waiting for a response, he spent most of his time reviewing old records, cases of the mine collapse, long-buried criminal investigations, and files on scientists expelled from the Royal Society in centuries past. One name kept recurring, Elric Malden. A genetic biologist once expelled from the Institute for conducting experiments on living subjects. Rumor had it he perished in a laboratory fire. But Holmes discovered, no body was ever found. He said. Perhaps Elric didn't die. He simply vanished, and continued his work underground, where no one could supervise him. A chill ran through me. What we were facing was no longer a simple case. It was the consequence of corrupted knowledge, of crossing ethical boundaries without reckoning with the cost. Holmes muttered, as if reminding himself. To hunt the monster, we must first find its father. Chapter 7, The Phantom in the Research Institute. There are things that do not belong to nature, nor to mankind. They are the result of ambition exceeding the bounds of morality, and once created, they never submit to control. After 3 days of continuous travel, Holmes and I arrived at the London Institute of Biological Research. Home to some of the brightest minds in genetic structure analysis and molecular biology. The building was nestled within a quiet campus, surrounded by rows of ancient trees and guarded by multiple layers of locked doors. Holmes handed the vial containing the creature's DNA to Dr. Frederick Lang, a leading expert and someone who had once assisted him in the case of the mutated bees back in 1885. Lang was a man of logic and composure, but after placing the sample under the electron microscope and conducting a few basic chemical reactions, his expression changed completely. Lang spoke, his voice lowered as though he had just confronted something that defied every known scientific principle. This DNA sequence doesn't resemble any species I've ever encountered. It's a composite. A complex fusion of at least 5 different organisms, mammals, reptiles, insects, and even some genetic segments that don't appear in any known database of life. Holmes remained silent for a moment. He wasn't surprised, he was merely confirming a hypothesis he had long suspected: the creature we encountered was no legend. It was a hybrid, an engineered biological machine with a purpose. Lang requested to keep the specimen for deeper analysis. He showed us a photo of a broken genetic structure, segments of DNA unnaturally recombined, as though forced together by a technology yet to be revealed to the world. I couldn't take my eyes off the image. It gave me the impression of a creature torn apart and stitched back together by human hands, each seam carrying a haunting weight. That evening, Holmes and I were invited to stay overnight in the Institute's residential quarters. A light rain fell, and mist clung to the glass panes. Holmes remained immersed in the preliminary analysis Lang had sent him, each line an affirmation that what we were dealing with was no accident. Around midnight, while we were documenting our deductions in a journal, a knock came at the door. A pale-faced intern stood there, announcing that Dr. Lang had been found dead in the main laboratory. There were no signs of forced entry, no cries for help, and no security alarms had been triggered. We rushed to the scene. Lang lay slumped beside the gene analysis machine, eyes wide open in a frozen stare, foam still clinging to his lips, his hand tightly clutching the genetic map. There were no signs of a struggle, nothing was missing, no visible wounds. But what truly unnerved me was his expression, not merely fearful, but utterly horrified, as though he had seen something beyond the limits of human comprehension. Holmes ordered the entire lab floor to be sealed and requested an immediate review of all security footage from the previous 12 hours. But something strange emerged. All data from exactly 11:46 p.m. to 12:01 a.m. was missing, the very time Lang had been killed. It wasn't a technical fault. The data had been erased manually, either by someone inside the institute, or by something intelligent enough to do so. Holmes found the faintest clue, a droplet of clear liquid beneath the desk, stuck to the leg of the chair. He carefully collected the sample with a special pipette and sealed it in a vial. His eyes, in that moment, sharpened. He had realized something vital. I asked, "Do you think someone killed Lang?" Holmes replied, "Not someone. And not entirely an animal either." A chill crept down my spine. If it wasn't a person, there could be only one explanation: the creature had followed the trail of its own DNA. Perhaps it sensed that its existence had been discovered, and reacted, instinctively. Holmes nodded, his gaze distant. "We've touched on something it doesn't want revealed." At dawn, an independent forensics team arrived to examine Lang's body. Their initial findings sent the institute into shock: no signs of poisoning, no damage to the brain, heart, or lungs. But the level of adrenaline in Lang's blood was 12 times that of a normal person, a figure nearly beyond belief. Lang had died of cardiac arrest brought on by extreme terror. As though he had faced something that shattered his reason in a matter of seconds. Holmes stared at the report, then whispered, "It doesn't need to kill. It only needs to appear." We left the institute shortly thereafter. Holmes was silent for most of the journey. He spoke only once, as a warning. "From now on, we are no longer the hunters. It is watching us." That evening, in a shabby lodging house on the outskirts of London, Holmes laid out a map of all the incident locations, from the forest with the red eyes and hanging corpses, to the underground lab in the mine, to today's institute. Each was a point on a circle. At its center, was the Blackmere ruins, where it had all begun. Holmes said, "This creature doesn't roam aimlessly. It has a purpose. It protects the secret of its creator. And now, it knows we're breaking the circle." I asked, "What do we do now?" Holmes looked at me, eyes burning. "We go to the center. Before it finds the next victim." Chapter 8, The One Behind the Shadows. There is no monster more dangerous than a human with a superior intellect and no moral boundaries. Holmes sat motionless the entire morning, his eyes fixed on the map laced with red threads connecting the sites of death. He was no longer confronting a creature's form, but something far more terrifying, the mind behind it. I stepped in with a cup of tea, gently placing it on the table, but Holmes didn't move. He remained transfixed on the letter Dr. Lang had written before his death, the final scribbled lines found in his coat pocket. We had once assumed it was random notation, but Holmes had just deciphered it, a name. Aldridge. A name erased from all official records on biological science and genetic technology 10 years prior. An explosion at a laboratory in North Yorkshire was believed to have killed him and his entire research team. But Holmes shook his head. There was no physical evidence confirming that death. No bodies. No forensic report. And most notably, no justifiable reason to destroy all research data afterward. He pointed to an old photograph, taken at a secret scientific symposium over a decade ago. In the far right corner stood a tall man in a long black coat, gaunt-faced with deep-set eyes. No name beneath the image. But Lang had once spoken of a friend who dreamed of creating a superior being, one not bound by natural evolution. We began to trace Aldridge. The journey took us to a remote countryside in the north, where the ruins of the old laboratory perched on a cliffside now sealed off. Locals still spoke of eerie screeches at night, flickering lights in the fog, and shapeless shadows gliding across the fields. We sought out the lab's last known caretaker. Old Jasper, a former operations engineer. His mind was mostly lost to time, speaking only in fragmented, cryptic sentences. But when Holmes mentioned the name Aldrich, his gaze shifted. In a raspy voice, he muttered, "Not dead, he's not dead. The second chamber, below, still open." Then he cackled and collapsed backward, eyes wide in terror, as though strangled by the very memories that haunted him. Holmes recorded every word Jasper uttered. He began to see more clearly. Aldrich hadn't just survived, he had continued his research. And the creature was no mindless beast. It had a purpose, a discipline, because it was under control. We returned to Blackmere Castle, where Holmes had first discovered the underground lab. Beneath layers of dust and crumbling brick, he found a hidden stone mechanism behind a long-abandoned fireplace. Holmes pressed the bricks in a particular sequence. There was a soft click, and then a wall cracked open, revealing a spiral staircase descending even deeper. Down to the second sublevel Jasper had mentioned. The air below was frigid, saturated with the scent of damp rot and old metal. We swept our flashlights through narrow corridors, where rusted steel doors remained sealed. Some hung ajar, revealing the remnants of testing chambers, sketches of hybrid beings with human heads, animal torsos, and insect eyes. I looked around and felt as though we were stepping into the nightmare of a mad god. Holmes whispered, "This is no longer science. This is biological heresy." The final room at the end of the corridor opened into a cold chamber, where we discovered a secure storage cabinet. Holmes broke the lock. Inside were audio recordings, documents, and a yellowed leather journal. On its cover was a spiral symbol, the same one we had seen embedded in the gene sample. We read every word. It was Aldrich's journal. In scattered handwriting, he described the process of creating a being he called Hyperion, a creature beyond mere survival and instinct. It was composed of a multitude of powerful species, its mind programmed with artificial memories. And most frightening of all, it could learn, remember, and reason. The final page read clearly, "Hyperion must never escape. Unless there is a traitor." Holmes looked up. Then someone else is involved. Someone still alive, who has released the creature into the world. Back on the surface, Holmes didn't rest. He wrote tirelessly, flipping through old reports and piecing together minute details. At last, he looked at me, his eyes blazing. "Aldrich doesn't kill. He commands Hyperion to eliminate those who come too close to the truth." I asked, "But why leave traces? Why not conceal everything completely?" Holmes replied, "Because he's not afraid. To him, the entire world is a laboratory. And we are nothing more than variables in a predetermined experiment." That night, Holmes composed a letter to the Supreme Scientific Council. The very institution that had once funded Aldrich before the explosion. He demanded a list of all individuals who had worked with Aldrich and were later reported missing or withdrew without explanation. A list was returned. One name made Holmes furrow his brow: Dr. Gregory Marlin, Aldrich's chief assistant, and formerly a specialist in artificial neural programming. Holmes circled the name and said, "If there was a traitor to Aldrich or someone who unleashed Hyperion, it's him." Rain began to fall as we left the castle. In the battered suitcase we carried were the full records, the genetic map, and Aldrich's journal. Holmes said, "We now know what it is, who made it, and why it was set loose. The only thing left is to figure out how to stop it. Because if we don't, Lang's death will be just the beginning." Chapter 9, The Memory of the Survivor. Nothing is more painful than realizing the monster we are hunting was once a human being. That afternoon, a light rain fell over London. Beneath a thin layer of mist, Holmes moved like a phantom through the narrow alleys of the city's East End, where old brick houses crowded together and every sound seemed muted. We were tracking a man, the last surviving witness who had once worked in Aldrich's laboratory, someone who might hold the most crucial missing piece. Holmes said nothing during the entire walk. His face was tense, eyes fixed on the note in his hand. The man's name was Walter G. Hensley, a technician in charge of biological data storage. According to the records, he had vanished after the explosion, leaving no trace. But Holmes had found a pharmacy receipt paid for under a false name, just a few months prior, near Whitechapel. That was the lead. We found Walter living in a third-floor boarding room. The wooden door was rotting, the air reeked of antiseptic and dampness, invading the lungs. He was not surprised to see Holmes, he merely sighed and sat down, trembling as he poured tea. Holmes didn't speak right away. He sat in silence, allowing it to fill the room. Then Walter spoke, his voice breaking. "You think it's a monster. But you're wrong. We turned a human being into that thing." The story began 10 years ago, when Aldrich led a small team into a line of unauthorized research. The goal wasn't merely to create a gene-spliced hybrid, it was to reconstruct the entire human biological system, to create a being that was immortal, both physically and mentally. The test subject wasn't an animal. Not a simulated genome. But, a boy. Walter didn't remember the child's real name. He was an orphan, lured into the lab with promises of curing a genetic illness. Aldrich had injected him with dozens of synthetic DNA strands, altered his brain structure, and forced his body to develop under strictly controlled conditions. But what no one expected was this: the experiment worked. The boy didn't die. He evolved, faster than any model had ever predicted. Holmes sat motionless, his head tilted slightly, as though threading ideas together. Walter continued. At first, he was still aware. Every day, he asked us who he was, why he was there, why his body kept changing hour by hour. But no one answered. We recorded, monitored, injected. One day, he stopped asking. And then he began to look at us as strangers. As threats. One night, the security systems were disabled. An explosion occurred. The laboratory went up in flames. Aldrich disappeared. And I hid inside a pressurized gas chamber. I survived. Holmes asked just one question. What was the child's code name? Walter answered. Hyperion. We left the room before dusk. Holmes didn't say a word during the walk back. But I noticed his hand clenched tightly, veins bulging beneath his pale skin. Back at the flat, Holmes laid out photographs of the victims on the table. Then, with a red pen, he marked the wounds that were similar, all avoided instant fatal points. There were no killing blows. Each death had resulted from prolonged pain. Holmes muttered. Not killing to eat. Not killing out of madness. This is punishment. That entire night, he buried himself in constructing a psychological profile of Hyperion, a creature forced to evolve, stripped of identity, imprisoned in darkness since childhood, then left to burn in the inferno created by those who made him. Holmes concluded. Hyperion isn't a monster. He is a victim. And now, he punishes those who turned him into what he is. I asked. But what about the innocent? Lang? The genetic analyst? Holmes replied. Lang attended a symposium on artificial gene modeling. He once opposed Aldrich. Perhaps he discovered someone was repeating the same mistakes. As for the analyst, she decoded Hyperion's DNA. Which means Hyperion knew she was uncovering his origin. I shivered. Holmes simply rose, eyes gleaming in the dark. We are no longer hunting a monster. We are tracing a trail of pain. The next day, Holmes asked me to send letters to every neurological hospital that had admitted children with genetic abnormalities more than a decade ago. The list gradually narrowed, down to 5 names. From there, he found file number 112C, a boy of unknown identity, listed as having a previously unseen genetic mutation, later transferred to a private research center, the facility that would become Aldrich's lab. The final page of the file bore one line: no relatives. No claimant. Code, Hyperion. Holmes said. If there is any humanity left in him, then the last thing he would want to know is why he was abandoned. We visited St. Roderick's Monastery, where the boy had once been raised before being taken. An elderly nun remembered, not his name, but his eyes. The eyes of a child who did not cry, did not laugh, only watched in silence. Once, when wrongly punished, the boy didn't react. He simply stood still for a long time and asked, "If I disappeared, would anyone remember me?" Holmes closed his eyes. He whispered. He doesn't kill out of hatred. He kills to be remembered. Chapter 10, The Truth in the Abandoned Asylum. In the darkness, the truth always waits for those who dare to face it. Following the mounting trail of clues, Holmes and I set out for a place no one wanted to remember, a decrepit mental asylum far from the city center. This was once the holding facility for Dr. Aldrich, after his actions were deemed insane and dangerous. But the asylum had been abandoned for years, swallowed by dust and the grim memories of those who once inhabited it. The rusted iron gate creaked dryly as Holmes pushed it open. Dim light filtered through shattered windows, casting pale streaks across the worn cement floor. The space was empty save for the echo of our footsteps and the wind whistling through the cracks. Holmes stopped in the middle of a long corridor, glancing around, his eyes sharp and cold as if piercing every hidden secret. We entered room 17, the place where Aldrich was said to have lived out his final years in seclusion. On a rotting wooden table, beneath a thick layer of dust, Holmes discovered an abandoned journal. Turning its pages, he read slowly, each line penned in fading ink but still heavy with weight. The journal revealed Aldrich's final experiments, a program to create a being known as Alpha 1. This was no ordinary gene splicing project, but an attempt to shatter every natural limit, the creation of the first organism with both superior intellect and extraordinary physical strength. Alpha 1 was not simply the monster we were hunting. It was the culmination of dark ambition, the product of a madman's desire to conquer the very essence of humanity. Holmes looked up, his eyes flashing in the gloom. He spoke, not to me, but as if to himself. This creature understands us. It knows fear, knows pain, knows hatred and desire. It is not blind in its destruction. It chooses its targets, it has a reason. We searched further through the room, finding genetic samples preserved in an old refrigerator. Each vial seemed to contain a fragment of the horrifying story. Holmes carefully packed them away for further analysis. What chilled me were the final lines in the journal. Aldrich wrote of a dark night when Alpha 1 broke free from control and attacked the lab staff. But he didn't call it a monster. He called it his child, a being capable of feeling and vengeance. Holmes calculated aloud. If Alpha 1 is choosing its targets, then the victims are not random. They were people who participated in covering up, or tried to shut down, Aldrich's project. Each murder is a piece in a meticulous plan of retribution. As we left the abandoned asylum, I noticed Holmes deep in thought, bearing a heaviness I had rarely seen in him. He said to me, "We are not merely hunting a creature. We are facing the fury and pain of someone who was betrayed. To stop this catastrophe, we must understand its soul." I knew the road ahead would be difficult. But one thing was certain, darkness does not always conceal the truth. Sometimes, it is in darkness that the truth is laid bare. Chapter 11, The Chase on a Stormy Night. Sometimes, the truth echoes most powerfully during fierce nights of rain and wind. That stormy night did more than drown out the city's sounds, it concealed the desperate screams of a creature beyond imagination. Holmes and I were in the dark room of the military command center, where soldiers intently watched screens showing images from surveillance cameras lining the weapons transport route. Then, the unthinkable happened. A giant monster, likely Alpha 1, attacked the military convoy. The shaky black and white footage clearly captured glowing red eyes, powerful swipes that blew open cargo containers, and a massive figure charging across the fog-covered road. It was the first time the public could see clearly the being who had long been a ghost in mysterious murder cases. Holmes wasted no time. He immediately coordinated with the military commander to plan a pursuit, determined not to let the creature escape. We set out, racing through rain-slicked roads under torrents of rain, headlights cutting through the gloomy night. The chase led us to the seaside cliffs, where crashing waves roared and the wind howled. The monster was surrounded, trapped with no escape. The tension was so thick it felt almost tangible. Suddenly, amid the howling wind and pouring rain, the creature cried out in a clear, resonant voice we never expected. It said it only wanted to live. Those words stirred within me a mix of fear and compassion. Perhaps the monster was not merely a killing machine, but a living being struggling with existence, pain, and the longing for freedom. Holmes looked at me, his eyes deep and contemplative. He was not facing a simple enemy, but a far greater mystery, an untold tragedy. The chase on that stormy night was not just a battle between man and monster. It was a struggle for life, for justice, and for understanding what we call humanity in a creature beyond all limits. Chapter 12: The Corruption of a Genius. When genius crosses the boundary of morality, darkness not only engulfs the world but also invades the human soul. After the chaotic chase on the seaside cliffs, Holmes and I continued to follow a faint trail leading to a secret base hidden deep inside a desolate cave, far away from the noise of the outside world. The path into the cave was dark and slippery with rainwater and moss, as if challenging anyone daring enough to step inside. Holmes moved cautiously, his eyes never leaving even the smallest details on the surrounding rock walls. We passed through narrow corridors and remnants of old laboratories, evidence of the mad scientific projects Dr. Aldrich once carried out. Suddenly, from the shadows, a deep warm voice rang out, stopping both Holmes and me in our tracks. Aldrich was still alive. He appeared before us, his face cold but his eyes shining with determination and not a trace of remorse. He solemnly explained his purpose. Not to create monsters, but to create the perfect human, a being with superior strength and extraordinary intellect, intended to serve humanity's future. According to Aldrich, he was simply ahead of his time, and the world was not yet mature enough to understand his vision. Holmes listened intently, each word from Aldrich weighing heavily on his mind like an ethical challenge. This was no longer a simple hunt, it was a confrontation with larger questions. Could a creature like Alpha 1, despite being altered, still retain its humanity? Could one forgive the corruption of a genius who lost himself in ambition? Holmes stood at a difficult crossroads, to eliminate Alpha 1 to protect human safety, or to try to prove and preserve the remaining humanity within the creature, even if that meant accepting unpredictable risks. The tense atmosphere filled the entire cave. I looked into Holmes's eyes and saw the inner struggle growing stronger. Finally, he spoke to me in a low, resolute voice that the path ahead would not only be a battle against an external enemy but also a journey to seek the deeper meaning of life and compassion. We left the cave with a new burden on our shoulders, knowing that every step in this journey could change the fate of the world. Chapter 13: The Final Choice. In the decisive moment, the truth can become as sharp as a blade, cutting through all beliefs and deceptions. As the darkness of the cave enveloped us, Alpha 1 stepped forward, not fierce, not aggressive as everyone had imagined. Instead, it wrapped itself willingly in sturdy ropes, showing clear signs of voluntary submission and urgency. No longer a mindless predator, it resembled a creature pleading for forgiveness and release from some invisible chains. Its voice rang out clearly, leaving all of us stunned. It insisted it had never wanted to kill anyone. The deaths and destruction were caused by another, Dr. Aldrich, who had used a special sonic signal to control it like a puppet. Holmes did not hesitate. He drew his gun and aimed it directly at Aldrich, who stood there with a mad smile on his face, his eyes gleaming with defiance and recklessness. The space seemed to freeze for a moment. We all felt the suffocating weight of that fateful instant. Suddenly, Aldrich pressed a trigger, emitting a sharp sound that only special beings like Alpha 1, and something even more terrifying, could hear. From the darkness at the far end of the cave, a massive figure appeared, Alpha 2, a stronger, more dangerous, and utterly unpredictable version. The presence of Alpha 2 heightened the tension to its peak. Holmes stood firm, his hand still on the gun, ready to face any situation. In his mind, the greatest question remained: how to end this game without paying the price with innocent lives. I saw the determination in Holmes's eyes, a decision that could change the fate not only of the monster but of the entire world. That night, in the cold cave, a battle awaited, not just of flesh and blood, but a war of will and morality. Chapter 14, The End of the Monster, or of the Human. When the line between monster and human blurs, the battle is not only about survival but also about the essence of one's own self. The final battle erupted deep within the cavern, where the flickering torchlight reflected off the cold stone walls. Alpha 1 and Alpha 2 faced each other, every move a fierce struggle between wild instinct and the remaining will of reason. Each strike, each dodge, revealed the complexity and tragedy of a creature no longer purely beast, yet not entirely human. Holmes stood hidden behind a large rock, intensely focused. He silently observed, searching for the chance to disable the control device Aldrich had attached to Alpha 1. That device was the key keeping the monster restrained, but also the chain that bound the remaining human soul inside. Watson supported Holmes, quietly handing him the necessary tools, eyes tense and fixed on the two gigantic beings entangled in a tempestuous clash. Suddenly, as Alpha 2 launched a decisive blow, Holmes sprang up, skillfully twisted, and severed the control signal's wire. A piercing screech echoed as Alpha 1 trembled violently, breaking free from forced control. The change was immediate and clear on its face. Instead of fury, there was a faint glimmer of consciousness and pain. Alpha 2 continued its assault, but now Alpha 1 was no longer a puppet, it was a warrior fighting for its own life and freedom. Amid the chaos, Aldrich was unexpectedly attacked by Alpha 2 itself. His death was an inevitable punishment, like a stone cast directly at the mad ambition that had sown so much suffering. Aldrich's final groans echoed through the cave, swallowed by the roaring of the two colossal creatures. After a weary struggle, Alpha 1 suddenly withdrew and approached Holmes and Watson. It stopped, eyes deep and troubled as if holding a vast sea of memories, then uttered a single sentence before disappearing into the darkness. "If one day I return, remember that I once chose not to kill." Silence returned, broken only by the wind whistling through the rock crevices, carrying the sorrow and hope of a creature who once bore the name human. Holmes watched the fading silhouette, eyes heavy with reflection on the fragile boundary between good and evil, between life and destruction. We left the cave burdened with the knowledge that the story of the monster was not just a case to solve but a lesson about the very nature of humanity itself.